Rainy Night Stalker. On that rainy night in Seattle, I was driving home after a long day at work. My routine was familiar. Leaving the office downtown, grabbing a coffee from the Starbucks on the corner, and driving through the wet streets of the city to my apartment in Capitol Hill. The rain tapped lightly against the windshield of my old Honda Civic, and the soft sound of music on the radio helped me relax as I drove. I was thinking about the weekend, eager for some rest and maybe a classic horror movie on Netflix. Little did I know that I was about to live my own horror story that night. As I drove along Interstate 5, I noticed a black car that seemed to be following me closely. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just heading in the same direction. But when I took my usual exit and the car did the same, a faint unease crept in. The car's headlights seemed to pierce through the rearview mirror, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than a coincidence. I tried to dismiss the thought, but a chill ran down my spine as if something wasn't right. When I turned onto my street, the car continued to follow. My heart began to race as I realized I was running out of excuses for the persistent presence of that vehicle. It was almost 10 at night and there was little traffic on the streets. I thought about stopping in front of a friend's house to see if the car would follow, but the fear of looking paranoid stopped me. Instead, I drove straight to my apartment building, determined to get inside quickly and forget this strange coincidence. After parking, I noticed the mysterious car had stopped across the street, its engine still running. With hurried steps, I ran along the sidewalk to the entrance of my building. Once inside the lobby, I felt an inexplicable sense of being watched. I glanced back and, through the lobby window, saw a shadow in the dark car, the figure indistinct against the streetlight. I decided to lock the door immediately and go up to my second-floor apartment, hoping that the safety of being inside would bring some relief. The rain started to fall harder, pounding against the windows with an intensity that drowned out any sound from outside. Even so, I couldn't shake the thought of that car, and the feeling of impending danger wouldn't let me rest. I tried to calm my nerves, but the paranoia lingered. I decided to check the building's security cameras through the app on my phone. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the same figure in front of the building, now out of the car, staring directly into the camera. Seeing that figure staring through the camera left me frozen for a moment. I knew I needed to do something, but my body seemed unwilling to obey. Finally, my mind cleared enough for me to act. I called the police and explained the situation, but they said they could only send a patrol if there was an immediate threat. This only heightened my fear. I looked at the cameras again and realized the figure had disappeared from view, making me feel even more vulnerable. Determined not to stay home any longer, I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, quickly descending the stairs to the building's entrance. The black car was still parked across the street, but the driver was out of sight. I ran to my car, started the engine, and drove aimlessly, just wanting to put distance between me and that place. I ended up at a 24-hour convenience store, hoping to find some comfort in the presence of other people. Inside the store, the security guard looked at me with concern, and I felt I could finally let my guard down, even if only for a moment. As I walked through the aisles trying to decide between a hot tea or something more comforting, I noticed the security guard staring intently outside the store. Following his gaze, I saw, to my horror, the familiar figure outside, now under the streetlights, standing by his car. He seemed to be watching the convenience store with an intensity that made me shiver. It was as if he knew I was inside. The security guard gave me a worried look, as if he sensed something was very wrong, and that made me feel a bit safer. He asked if I was okay, but my voice failed, and I could only shake my head no. Suddenly, the store's door opened, and the figure entered. My heart almost stopped when I realized I knew that face. It was a former coworker, someone I barely spoke to. He seemed calm, but there was something sinister in his posture, and the way his eyes immediately found mine. He approached, and the security guard stepped between us, asking if everything was all right. The tension in the air was palpable, and I felt that the danger was more real than ever. The man tried to play it off, saying he just wanted to talk, but I knew there was more behind his words. The security guard asked the man to leave, sensing that his presence was unwanted and disturbing. The figure hesitated for a moment, but eventually complied, giving me one last intense look before leaving. My hands were shaking as I thanked the security guard, who kindly offered to walk me to my car. As we walked together, the rain still poured heavily, and the night's darkness seemed to envelop everything around us. I felt a twinge of relief when I got into my car, but the sense of safety was illusory. I decided it was time to go back home, convinced that this night would never end if I didn't take action. I called a trusted friend, asked him to meet me at my apartment, and explained what was happening. I drove back, checking the rearview mirror every minute, but the black car was nowhere in sight. When I got home, I found my friend already waiting for me. His presence gave me courage, and together we went up to my apartment. As he checked the security cameras, I received a message from an unknown number. "This isn't over." The dread returned, but now there was a greater determination not to let fear win. I decided the best thing was to go to my friend's house until the situation was resolved. I packed a small bag and, with my heart still racing, went down the stairs with him. As we exited the building, a lightning flash briefly lit the street, and for a moment, I thought I saw the black car in the distance. My nerves were on edge, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. We got into his car and drove off, with the sound of the rain still hammering the windows. As we pulled away, I looked back and saw the black car emerging at the intersection behind us. The stalker was still there, following us from a distance, and I realized that this endless night was just the beginning of a new nightmare. The rainy night vigil. It was a typical Friday evening as I left the office in downtown Seattle, eager to get home to Bellevue after a long week. The city lights reflected off the wet streets as the rain started to fall, creating a rhythmic patter on the windshield of my old Subaru. I settled into the familiar routine of my commute, the radio playing softly in the background as I navigated the busy highways. The comforting monotony of the drive often gave me time to unwind and think, but tonight, there was a strange sense of unease I couldn't shake, as if someone was watching me. The rain intensified as I merged onto Interstate 90, the dark sky rumbling ominously. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the wipers working furiously to keep up with the downpour. The road was nearly deserted, and visibility was rapidly declining. Just as I was considering pulling over to wait out the storm, I noticed headlights approaching from behind at an alarming speed. A sleek black SUV flew past me, hydroplaning slightly before regaining control and disappearing into the murk ahead. The brief encounter sent a shiver down my spine, a hint of foreboding settling in my gut. A few miles later, I saw the SUV again, this time parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down instinctively, noticing two figures standing outside the vehicle. They were soaked to the bone, waving frantically as I approached. My initial instinct was to stop and offer help, but something about their wild gestures and the darkness in their eyes as they locked onto mine made me hesitate. Instead, I sped up, feeling a pang of guilt as I drove past, their silhouettes quickly swallowed by the rain. Arriving home, I pulled into my driveway, relieved to see the familiar shape of my suburban house. The warm glow from the living room lamp seeped through the curtains, a welcoming beacon on such a dreary night. I shook off the lingering unease, chalking it up to the weather and the stress of the week. After changing into dry clothes, I settled on the couch with a hot cup of tea, determined to relax. The patter of rain on the roof was soothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. It wasn't long before a sharp knock on the window startled me, causing the tea to slosh over the rim of my cup. My heart pounded as I approached the window cautiously, peering into the darkness outside. The porch light revealed a figure standing just beyond its reach, their features obscured by the shadows. I froze, the earlier encounter with the SUV flashing through my mind. Gathering my courage, I called out, asking who was there, but received only silence in return. The figure turned and vanished into the night, leaving me trembling in the safety of my home. An hour passed and I couldn't calm the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. Every creak of the house and whisper of wind outside seemed amplified, feeding my growing paranoia. I decided to check the doors, making sure they were securely locked, and glanced out the windows periodically, searching for any signs of movement. The rain had lessened slightly, but the oppressive weight of the atmosphere remained, pressing down on me like a tangible presence. I kept my phone close, ready to call for help at the slightest provocation. Suddenly, I heard the sound of breaking glass coming from the back of the house, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the wooden floors. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a flashlight and edged towards the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. I ducked into the laundry room, hoping the intruder would overlook my hiding spot. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. Holding my breath, I prayed for them to move on, every second stretching into an eternity. The door creaked open, and I flicked off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. I could hear the heavy breathing of the intruder, feel the heat of their presence as they paused, seeming to sense my fear. In a moment of desperation, I lunged forward, using the flashlight as a makeshift weapon, striking blindly in the dark. A grunt of pain followed by a crash gave me a split second to escape, my feet pounding against the floor as I ran for the front door. I could hear them scrambling to follow, their footsteps echoing mine in a frantic race. I barely managed to throw open the door and sprint into the rain-soaked yard, adrenaline propelling me forward. The storm had returned in full force, the rain lashing against my skin as I stumbled towards my neighbor's house. I could hear the pursuer behind me, their presence a looming shadow just out of sight. I screamed for help, hoping the noise would wake someone, anyone who could come to my aid. Finally reaching my neighbor's porch, I pounded on the door, praying for salvation as the darkness threatened to overtake me. Safe inside, the police were called, and the house was searched. They found signs of forced entry, but no sign of the intruder. I recounted the events to the officers, my voice trembling as I described the fear that had gripped me. They reassured me, promising to increase patrols in the area and advising me to stay with friends for a few days. But even as they spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was still lurking, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I packed a bag to stay at a friend's house, I found a note slipped under my front door. The words were smudged from the rain, but the message was clear. Next time, you won't be so lucky. My blood ran cold, and a new wave of terror washed over me. Despite the police presence, despite the comfort of friends, I knew that the night's events would haunt me forever. The rain continued to fall as I drove away, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching me from the shadows once more. Rainy night on Route 13. It was a Friday night, and I was driving back home from my job in Syracuse, heading towards my small apartment on the outskirts of Binghamton. The rain was relentless, turning the highway into a slippery ribbon under the dull glow of the streetlights. My windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, barely keeping up with the downpour. The radio played softly in the background, offering some company on the otherwise lonely stretch of Route 13. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I dismissed it as paranoia brought on by the eerie weather and the hour. The rain intensified as I decided to pull over at a 24-hour convenience store near Ithaca to grab a cup of coffee and maybe wait out the worst of the storm. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I entered, casting long shadows across the aisles. The place was empty except for the cashier, a tired-looking man who greeted me with a nod. As I browsed the aisles, the rain's rhythmic drumming against the roof seemed to grow louder, a constant reminder of the dark, wet world outside. I grabbed a steaming cup of coffee and headed back to the counter. As I paid, the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in, drenched from head to toe. He looked out of place, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. Something about him set me on edge, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He stood by the door, glancing around the store as if looking for something or someone. I quickly turned back to the cashier, paid for my drink, and decided it was time to leave, the uneasiness in my gut growing stronger with each passing moment. I hurried to my car, splashing through puddles, and got in, locking the doors behind me. The man's presence had left a strange impression on me, but I dismissed it as nothing more than a tired mind playing tricks. As I started the engine and began to pull away from the store, I caught a glimpse of the man standing under the awning, watching me intently. A chill ran down my spine as our eyes briefly met, his expression unreadable in the shadowed darkness. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. My mind raced as I drove along the deserted highway, every shadow seeming to stretch and twist in the peripheral. The rain created a blurry curtain around me, making it difficult to see clearly. I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, approaching fast. The car seemed to match my speed, hanging back just enough to stay in view. My pulse quickened. Was it him? Was I just being paranoid? Trying to remain calm, I pressed down on the gas, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car only followed suit, maintaining the gap. Feeling a creeping panic, I fumbled for my phone, dialing my roommate, Jake. His voice crackled over the speaker. I explained the situation, my words tumbling over each other as I tried to convey my fear. He urged me to drive to the nearest police station, but I was too far from anything familiar and wasn't sure of the exact location. The thought of stopping and facing whatever danger might be behind me filled me with dread. I glanced back and saw the car inching closer, its headlights burning through the rain. Realizing I had to act, I spotted an exit sign pointing towards a narrow road leading into a dense wooded area. Without thinking, I took the turn, my tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The trees loomed tall and dark on either side, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to swallow the road. My heart pounded as I continued down the path, my pursuer's headlights still visible in the rearview mirror. I hoped the thick woods would provide some cover, but the fear of getting lost in the maze of trees was just as terrifying. With no other options, I sped down the twisting road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The car behind me seemed undeterred, its headlights bobbing and weaving with each turn I made. Suddenly, the road took a sharp curve, and I veered off onto a dirt path, hoping to shake off my pursuer. My car jolted and bounced over the rough terrain, the rain turning the ground to mud. I prayed silently for the courage to see this through, knowing I had to keep moving no matter what. The car that had been following me finally came into view, its driver making no attempt to slow down as it approached the dirt path. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't lost them. I could feel their presence looming, getting closer with every second. The road was narrowing, flanked by trees that seemed to lean in, almost suffocating in their closeness. I could hear the engines roar, an insistent reminder of the danger pursuing me, relentless and determined. Panic gripped me as I pushed my car to go faster. Just when I thought I was doomed, I noticed a small clearing ahead, barely visible in the gloom. I turned into it, stopping the car and shutting off the headlights. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering as I waited in the oppressive silence. The rain softened to a drizzle, tapping lightly on the car roof. Moments later, the pursuing vehicle roared past the clearing, its driver oblivious to my presence. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me. But just as I began to think it was over, I noticed movement in the woods, shadows flitting between the trees. I stayed hidden in the car, trying to control my breathing, ears straining to catch any hint of the stranger's whereabouts. The shadows moved closer, taking shape, revealing the man from the convenience store. His silhouette was unmistakable against the dim light of the moon. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me as I realized he was searching methodically, determined. I couldn't stay there, waiting to be found. I needed to move, to escape before he discovered my hiding spot. Without a sound, I slipped out of the car and into the woods, keeping low and quiet. The rain had left the forest floor slick and treacherous, but I moved as quickly and quietly as possible. The man's presence was a palpable threat behind me, a reminder of the terror that had turned a simple drive into a nightmare. As I stumbled through the undergrowth, I glanced back and saw him standing near my car, his head tilted as if listening. I knew I had only moments before he resumed the hunt. The forest was dark, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I pushed onward, fueled by fear and the need to survive. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot and the rustling of leaves, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the urgency to escape. I thought of Jake, of how close I had come to something unthinkable. As I broke through the edge of the woods, I spotted a road, the distant lights of a town barely visible through the rain. With renewed hope, I made a break for it, refusing to look back at the nightmare I was leaving behind. Finally reaching the road, I stumbled onto the pavement, breathless and soaked. I looked back one last time, but the man was nowhere in sight. I flagged down a passing car, and a kind elderly couple stopped, their concern evident as they asked what had happened. I didn't have the words to explain, but they understood enough to offer me a ride to the nearest police station. As I climbed into their car, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. I knew that night would haunt me, a reminder of how easily safety could shatter. Even now, when it rains, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure once more.